So it's no secret that the Xbox generation has not been as successful as Microsoft wanted it to be. In this video, we'll be talking about why Game Pass and xCloud are perhaps the biggest factors that will influence the success of Xbox, especially in certain regions. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this content, and of course if you want more Xbox centric content, you can subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment to share your opinions if you agree or disagree with my view. Okay, so it's no secret that the Xbox generation hasn't been a massive success, at least not the way the 360 was. It's been a success at around 50 million users. The Xbox One can be considered a success. In fact, it is a success based off of Microsoft's latest earnings report. So Xbox Game Pass is being considered the Netflix of gaming. Pages like The Verge have written articles resembling it to Netflix. They're calling it the Netflix of gaming. And most companies that have come into the streaming market, whether it's Nvidia with its PC streaming, PC game streaming, or Sony with their acquisition of Gaikai, or even Stadia, the most recent entry, seem to have all fallen short in terms of expectations. For some reason, they're just not catching up as much as people want them to. And I think Microsoft kind of has something going on here with xCloud, especially when we consider Game Pass. The biggest problems people worry about when it comes to streaming are mostly, so the first reason is latency. Latency is delay. Delay networking is considered as latency. So how long does it take for you to press a button and you seeing the reaction on the screen? If the servers are hosted miles away from where you are, then you expect that the latency will be high, or that the reaction on the screen will take longer, because once you press, it has to go over your internet connection to the server and then back to your phone, right? So the further away the servers are, the more delay or the more the latency, and the worse the user experience. So people are always wary about latency. Depending on where you are in the world, this can be well managed, or it can be minimal, right? I know from my region, this is definitely going to be a big issue. The latency will be quite high. I don't think even Xbox game streaming will not be good enough, at least for a few years. This is one of the reasons Stadia is not actually succeeding as much as everybody thought it would, right? The promise was that it was definitely going to just work, right? But it's not working as good as it should be, right? So latency is the big problem. The next problem with game streaming is the games themselves. It's a game streaming service, so what about the games? If you go for a purely game streaming service like Stadia, for example, there is this fear. Google, for example, has always been known to axe programs, to stop programs that are not successful. They've got a graveyard of projects. Microsoft also has a graveyard of projects. To be fair, Mixer is the most recent one, right? But the fear here is that if I buy a game on Stadia and tomorrow Stadia does not exist, will I be refunded for the games that I owned, that I can only play on Stadia, that I can only play via streaming, right? So with Xbox Game Pass, I think this helps solve some of these problems. The latencies, of course, I think Stadia will still be technically better, at least for the majority of regions. But this is why Microsoft is rolling out in terms of regions, right? It's not rolling it out worldwide from the get-go. And this is why the Xbox app has been in beta for over a year now, right? Being in beta was brilliant. Why? Because they could do a whole lot of testing without it being considered a final product. And while it's in beta, they could test different regions, and they could even gauge the interest people have in those regions so that they know which areas they have to focus on. Microsoft has had to do a whole lot of work in the background, talking to different ISPs so that they use certain routers, certain paths just to reduce the latency, for example. All right. And then on the ownership of games, people who own an Xbox do not have to worry, because you can own games that you play through streaming, but also you can simply just play them locally on your Xbox. So if Microsoft decides, okay, this xCloud thing is not working, you can simply play your games on your Xbox the way you've always had to. You can't say the same for Stadia, right? So there is that aspect. The second thing is people who just subscribe to the streaming service if they do not want to own an Xbox, right? So you are paying a monthly fee. Every month you pay $15 or £11 in the UK, right? And what do you pay for that, right? Integrating Xbox Gamepass is genius, because what it means is that you instantly have access to over 100 games, right? Some of these games are indies, but these are really, really good indies from ID at Xbox. But some of them are really big games, AAA games, right? This year, Xbox Game Pass has had a lot of big games. We had GTA coming and left, Red Dead Redemption 2, right? Those are some of the biggest games of the previous and the current generation. The Metro game went into Game Pass. We had the Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I think Rise of the Tomb Raider is still in Game Pass. We've got quite a number of big games in Game Pass, right? So that's a big deal. So when you do get an Xbox Game Pass subscription with xCloud, or if you just decide to jump into xCloud for streaming games, you don't have to start thinking about buying games. You instantly have access to over 100 games that you can instantly play. And knowing that Microsoft will have to every game that launches from Xbox Game Studios will basically be launching day in the Game Pass service, means that you can trust that all the 15 studios are waiting for the same subscription. So in my view, this is the biggest factor that will affect the Xbox generation, because Game Pass itself has become a platform. Games are being listed to say launching on PC, launching on Xbox, launching on PlayStation, and launching in Game Pass, right? It's become its own platform. Okay, and why else would I think this is the biggest thing Microsoft has to perhaps push forward, right? Because Game Pass affects everything else, right? Game Pass affects their decisions of studios, because they want as many games as possible in the service. The more games they want, the more they want to make. The higher the quality of games, the more attractive the service is going to be for people. So this probably has an effect, and in the last few years we've probably seen that Microsoft has been acquiring studios, because it's expensive to pay Rockstar to put in Red Dead Redemption in such a program, right? But if they have a whole lot of first-party games launching in there, they can have a steady stream of content from their own developers, right? Not to say that the Xbox Game Studios isn't high quality. I think it's very, very high quality. Some of those teams like the Coalition, Ninja Theory, 343, Turn 10, Playground Games, Rare, Obsidian, those are really, really talented studios, right? So having games launch day in on Game Pass is very, very attractive, and it means that for the same subscription, someone can play the latest Xbox Game Studios games without even owning an Xbox, just by streaming them, right? This is, in my view, the most frictionless way someone can test out what the Xbox ecosystem is like. And in the long term, I think Microsoft will be more worried about the total number of active Xbox Live accounts, the ones that are actually using Game Pass and xCloud for streaming, then they will be about the console itself. The console is now just a platform to sell the service, to sell the Xbox Gamepass and xCloud services, right? And we can see that this has been happening around Microsoft for quite a long time, right? We can see Office used to be sold separately, right? But now you have Office 365, which is a subscription service, right? Windows itself might head into that direction. I don't know anything about that, but you can definitely see that pushing it as a service is what Microsoft wants the most, because with that you can definitely have a steady income from active users, right? And then people who are in the other ecosystem, in Sony's or Nintendo's ecosystem, they definitely want to buy the next PlayStation or the next Nintendo device and could be wary about getting an Xbox, right? Would you bet $500 on a console without actually having to test it, right? We can argue that, yeah, if they do announce some really big games that are going to be exclusive to the platform, that people would jump onto the Xbox ecosystem, but there will be people who always argue that they could play those games on PC, right? But let's say people can't afford a PC and do not want for some reason to get on Xbox, but maybe are intrigued to play a certain game, right? The cheapest way they could do that is just subscribe to Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, which has xCloud streaming, and then that streaming service would allow them, at least for that month, to be able to test out the game they want to do, right? And if it's a multiplayer game, they can be hooked, right? And as they try out different games, they could see that it's actually cheaper to play over on the Xbox side of things than it is on any other platform out there, really, right? So it's the most frictionless way in which people can try out games, and I think this is going to be a big push for Microsoft. Regions like Japan, basically Asia, has never been a stronghold for Microsoft, right? They've never sold well in those regions, and convincing those players, those developers, to be able to jump onto buying a new console is much harder than it is to tell them, okay, pay $15 and just try out our games over a streaming service, right? It's easier to make that argument. So people are more likely to try out the Xbox ecosystem through Game Pass, through xCloud streaming, because together they offer a whole lot of games while offering them cheaply, right? In South Korea, it's one of the places with the best internet connections around the world, right? Those guys were talking about 5G before anyone else was. The beta has worked really well. The xCloud beta has worked really well in South Korea. A lot of people have jumped in through the xCloud beta, right? And Microsoft put in a whole lot of effort in that region because of that. That's basically the example we have there, right? So in the long run, I think it will be easier to convince people to jump onto xCloud than it will be to jump onto the Xbox console as a platform. Over the years, Microsoft has done a whole lot of work to change the narrative, right? We had the narrative of the 1080p, 900p or 720p resolution gate back in 2013, with the Xbox One being the least powerful console and the Sony device being the more powerful console. With the Xbox One X and the Xbox Series X, that narrative is dead. Then we had the Xbox has no games narrative, right? Microsoft has bought a whole lot of studios, and after the 23rd of July, that argument is dead, right? Xbox has games. Now we're having an argument where people are saying, no, maybe the Xbox does not have good games, right? Which is arguable, right? People would argue. I've seen some people who do like Xbox say, yeah, it doesn't have the same caliber of games as Sony has, right? But I think it's still a one-sided view. Sony is good at certain types of games and Microsoft is good at certain types of games as well. But if someone wants to try out the Xbox games, it's much cheaper than it's going to be with trying out Sony's games, right? So it will be a low barrier of entry. In other words, it's a low barrier of entry for Xbox customers to try out games than it is on any other platform. So for those reasons, I think Microsoft should really push hard on xCloud. They should make it the best service, but they already are by integrating Gamepass. Gamepass is what has been missing in these other platforms, in these other streaming services. Of course, you can stream PlayStation 3 games with Sony's service, right? But you don't see the same commitment that Xbox has given, right? You don't see the Sony first-party studios launching their games day one in that service. So they don't have the same level of commitment, right? But with Microsoft, you can see the commitment. They are going to push in every single game that they release into the service. This is going to be very enticing. It's going to be lucrative. All we need is one game that will stand out, perhaps one that can even win multiple awards at the Game Awards, Game of the Year, or best in a whole lot of categories, such that it makes a whole lot of news, right? Something like the way Flight Simulator is doing, right? Where you get a whole lot of 10 out of 10s, 9 out of 10s, a 90 something Metacritical score. A critically acclaimed game, a game that everyone will be talking about and people would want to try out. And then if it's in Game Pass, people will be tempted in jumping onto the Game Pass service. And with that, Microsoft will not have to worry about how many consoles they'll have to sell. They won't have to worry about how many boxes they sell, but overall, just the number of people subscribed to their service, and the more, the better, right? So this is basically why I think this way. That's why I think it's going to be the biggest factor. xCloud, even while in beta, has beaten every other streaming service, right? Maybe not in terms of the technical aspect, but in terms of everything else, the user experience, the availability of games, the backup if the streaming service does not work, right? A consistent stream of Xbox first-party games going into the service day in and day in on launch. Support from third-party studios like Rockstar, right? Having their games in there, lots of indie games, lots of AA games in the service, and so on. So for those reasons, the streaming wars are basically going to be over with xCloud, and it's going to be a new metric, a new category of measuring success going in the next generation. So that's my view. Like the video, leave your opinion in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this content. Sweshi out.